Let me just start off by introducing myself. I'm Professor Gundlach, and I teach in the law school on disability law, among other classes as well. And I also want to welcome, particularly in addition to the law school community members who are here, also I understand that there are a number of members from the wider university and the undergrad. So please, thrilled to have you here and welcome. So a couple of things I just wanted to start with before we begin. One, we are recording, and there is a transcript. So the live transcript and closed captioning is enabled for those who are attending. And I just want to begin by welcoming Professor Natalie Chin. She is an associate professor of law at CUNY Law School and co-director of their Disability and Aging Justice Clinic. They represent low-income New Yorkers in a range of issues, including prisoners' rights and securing due process protections in areas that include guardianship and alternatives to guardianship and disability-based discrimination. Prior to joining CUNY's faculty, she was a professor and director of the Disability and Civil Rights Clinic at Brooklyn Law School, which was, I believe, the first law school clinic that advocated for adults and intellectual and developmental disabilities. And prior to, as if that was not enough, prior to teaching, she litigated cases and led education and public policy reform efforts to achieve equal rights for LGBT people and individuals living with HIV at Lambda Legal. And her litigation has included cases that affect people with mental health disabilities and the elderly, as well as those involving violations of the 4th and the 14th Amendment. And prior to her legal career, which I think is very cool, she was a journalist in California and also working in South Africa, where she was reporting on social welfare issues and on Black South African women living in township and rural areas. And as we are about to hear, her scholarship explores the intersections of disability and civil rights law in areas that impact the most fundamental aspects of one's life, including sexuality, sexual rights, and reproductive justice. And I'm going to also drop her article that she is presenting on today into the chat so that people can access it and check it out after you listen to the presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Chin.
Hi, everybody. This is really wonderful. As you heard, I'm Professor Natalie Chin. I want to first thank Professor Gundlach and the DEIC Council for inviting me. And it's great that Deane Prudenti is here and all these students and everyone. So this should be a lot of fun. I appreciate that introduction. It makes me feel like I can't believe how quickly life passes us. I'm going to share my screen. All right. So today we're going to talk about centering disability justice. And as Professor Gundlach just explained, this paper I wrote, just to give you a little bit of background, I'll just disappear. Let me find you on my. So to give you a little background, so during COVID, I was thinking about, what article I was going to write, and I was going to expand on my scholarship around sexual rights and disability. And but then when COVID hit, all this information in the news was about people of color are dying disproportionately at a much faster rate of COVID. And the articles were, surprising. Wow, the systemic issues of racism and inaccess to healthcare have really exacerbated the fact that Black and brown people, Indigenous people, people of color are dying of COVID. And I thought to myself, well, where's that analysis around disabled people of color? I'm not seeing it, I'm not hearing it, and it really made me mad. And I thought, I want to hear more about this intersection because there's this bifurcation of race and disability in dialogue. In dialogue, I think in our classes at law school, when we read the newspaper, and when a pandemic hits like this, there is no conversation about how this pandemic is not just impacting people of color, but people of color who live at the intersection of marginalized identities such as disability, sexual orientation, gender identity. So I wrote this article pretty quickly. So, there's a lot of things I think I would expand on. So it's very much a preliminary look at this issue. And I want to sort of emphasize that it focuses on anti-Black racism. So it really is a sort of a microscopic look at the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the idea that I had is, we have this awesome statute, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, that was enacted 30 years ago. And it's done some awesome things, but it's falling short in areas that I noticed during COVID. Is how is it impacting in a positive way or moving the lives forward of disabled people of color, and particularly Black disabled people. So for this article, I kind of did, a historical analysis of our need to look at disability rights and our advocacy of disability rights through a lens that centers something called disability justice. And the idea is disability rights, we've looked at it through the single issue of disability and left out all of these other identities. People aren't just disabled, right? People live multi-issue lives, as Audre Lorde said. We do not live a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And with that, I went down this road, and the framework of today's conversation of this article is I'm going to talk about somebody named Michael Hickson, because I think it's really important when we're talking about disability rights to center the voices of those most impacted. So we'll start off with Michael Hickson, and we'll share what his experience was. I'll give you a very brief history, very, very brief history of the racialization of disability and the pathologizing of race. And then we'll get into ableism. One thing I think is most critical is sort of understanding what ableism is as it impacts the disability community and disability advocacy, and sort of our own internalized ableism and where it comes from. And then, just take a shot at the ADA in terms of letting sort of the provision that I think has really carried it forward and that we need to push back against, and introduce you to the concept of disability justice. And then, I'll end with showing you the 4, vignettes that I picked out for this article that really identified, and I wrote this in 2020. So I picked out in 2020, what's happening to disabled people of color? Let me look. And I found these 4 very, complex and troubling issues that I feel that the ADA has really fallen short. And we're going to end by talking about where do we go from here. And I wish I had answers. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the chat. I think there might be some audio trouble. There seems somebody, I think I'm going in and out.
I responded
okay,
to the
great.
person. I think they had,
All
I
right.
think they got back in.
All right, great. And so, I'm hoping to end on a bright note. I think writing this article, I don't have answers for, it's not how do we fix the ADA and our advocacy around ADA. It's more about how do we reimagine a future of disability rights that incorporates a racism, ableism consciousness lens. And I'll talk about what that means. So bridging the disconnect between the promises of the ADA for disabled Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and moving that needle forward to recalibrate, to say, okay, this is what we need to do better. We have this awesome, framework of disability that has been really successful in the past 30 years, but it has fallen short. And what can we do to change that? And so that's the overall framework for today, or the roadmap for today's conversation. So I'm really happy that you all are here to share. So the first thing I want to do is share a new screen with you and sound. And I urge everybody to turn up the volume. I'm going to play a very, very short clip here. And before I begin, this is the wife of somebody named Michael Hickson. Actually, let me go back here. I think this is more helpful if I give this to you. This is the beauty of Zoom, I think. So in this picture, you have somebody named Michael Hickson, his wife, and his 5 kids. Michael Hickson, as a Black man, he was a Black man. He was in his, I believe, his 40s. He had 5 kids, and he was in a car accident after he had a stroke and became a quadriplegic. He had a lot of health conditions, and he lived in a nursing home. And when he was in the nursing home, he contracted HIV. This is about March 2020. And after being in the nursing home for a while, the doctors determined that he should not receive life-sustaining treatment against what his wife of 18 years wanted. And for various reasons, the hospital asked for guardianship, and a guardianship was granted over Michael Hickson, despite the fact that his wife and 5 kids were there to help make decisions for him. And the guardian, along with the hospital, decided that he did not deserve life-sustaining treatment. So they stopped his hydration and nutrition for 6 days, again, over the objection of his wife of 18 years. So what I'm about to show you is, which I think was really, we want all our clients to do this, is his wife was having a conversation with the doctor and recorded the doctor. It's a little hard to hear, so turn up your volume, and also there are subtitles. And please throw in the chat if there's any issue if you can't see this. You all hear volume?
Not yet.
Okay, hold on a second. Let me just start this.
So as far as
Okay,
good. If it's
Yes.
a certain criteria, and it's not that we're afraid of side effects, it's that you have to fit a certain criteria. And right now, that criteria
Oops, I'm sorry.
is requiring an intubation. So if you were to get intubated, then he would be on it. But at this point, with the decision is, do we want to be extremely aggressive with his care, or do we feel like this will be futile? And the big question of futility is one that we always question. And the issue is, will this help him improve his quality of life? Will this help him improve anything? And will it ultimately change the outcome? And the thought is the answer is no to all of those.
But what would make you say no to all of those?
Because as of right now, his quality of life, he doesn't have much of one.
What do you mean?
So
because he's paralyzed with a brain injury, he doesn't have quality of life.
Correct.
Who gets to make that decision whether somebody's quality of life, if they have a disability,
Well, it's definitely not me.
their quality of life is not good?
So it's not me. I don't make that decision. However, it's will it affect his quality? Will it improve his quality of life? No, the answer is no.
But why wouldn't it? Being able to live isn't improving your quality of life?
There's no improvement with being intubated with a bunch of lines and tubes in your body and being on a ventilator for more than 2 weeks. Each of our people here have COVID and they're in respiratory failure. They've been here for more than 2 weeks.
So they basically are here just letting die.
If I were to be frank, yes.
So if somebody doesn't die, are you going to think that was just
So
chance?
I can count with one hand. There's 3 patients that have made it through.
But you can count 3.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Exactly. And I get your point. Like there are 3. However, he doesn't fit those 3. Those 3 are young people that don't have medical problems. This guy is young, but he has a number of medical problems.
So just so you know, my uncle is 90 years old.
Right.
He had COVID.
Right.
He has a bunch of medical problems. He has cancer.
Well, I would consider that a blessing, and every minute that he's still alive, a blessing.
Which is why to me you can't say that though, because
Right.
all the directions pointed to him as being a risk that he would make it, and he did. And I just had another relative of mine pass away who was younger than him.
Well, I'm gonna go with the data. I don't go with stories, because stories don't help me. Okay.
Me too.
So did those 3 that made it, did they get that dim, whatever it's called?
They did not.
No. They fought it just on their own with oxygen.
With oxygen.
And how long were they here?
Probably about 1.5 to 2 weeks. Some of them even longer. So
he's been here now since Tuesday.
right. However, his quality of life is different than theirs. They were walking, talking. People.
Well, he can't walk, obviously, even walk through the door to get here. So.
Right. And I don't mean to be frank or abrasive or anything, but at this point, we're gonna do what we feel like is best for him, along with the state, and this is what we decided.
So the fact that you're killing someone doesn't.
We don't think it's killing.
Okay.
Because I don't know when or if he will die, but I do think.
Well, we're all gonna die at some point.
Right. Exactly. we all. You're right. We all are gonna die. So I don't know when or if he will die.
Well,
but,
he is gonna die one.
But at this point, I don't think it would be humane or compassionate to put a breathing tube in this man and do the lines and tubes and all that stuff, because I don't think it will benefit him.
And I totally agree with you with the intubation part of it. I don't want him to do it. But I also don't think that you should just sit him somewhere to be comfortable until he finally just drifts away.
Right.
That to me is futile too, because that's saying that you're not trying to save somebody's life. You're just watching them go. The ship is sailing. I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me to not try. I don't get that part.
Right. And it's not easy. None of these things are easy. And this is a calculated decision. And we feel like this is what's going to be best for him.
Okay.
Okay?
So if this were your spouse, you would be okay with just
I would
watching?
totally do this if this was my mom, my dad, my brother, my sister, my spouse.
That's a lie. You wouldn't.
You can call me a liar, you can do whatever you want. However, this is how I feel. I've seen this certainly more than you have. And I've seen people die.
You
certainly
it
more,
but you haven't felt it like this because it's not personal.
You don't know anything about me.
Well, and you don't know about me.
Okay, let's, I
don't
know
know
this is
about
hard.
me either
I know this is hard, but let's.
This has been 3 years of watching it, so you don't know my life either.
Right, and I'm not saying that I do. But what I'm going to tell you is that this is a decision between the medical community and the state.
And the state. And forget about his wife and his family and his.
I have nothing to do with that.
Kids.
Give you a minute to sit with that. I'm sorry. So I just want you to sit with that for a minute. It's a calculated decision. He doesn't walk or talk. And, you know, when this happened, this was really the first time that the face of Blackness and disability was actually in the news, right? The idea that there was this intersection just wasn't really talked about. You know, the NPR picked it up, a few other, you know, Texas, this happened in Texas, other newspapers picked it up, but sort of the idea of the intersection and sort of, you know, we're never going to know whether the decision to hold, you know, life-sustaining treatment for Michael Hickson, you know, was because, you know, it was really futile and there's nothing that could be done medically, but we're also not going to know the role that racism, ableism, and other isms played into making this decision. And I think, you know, as we think through issues of disability rights, disability advocacy, it's important that we don't bifurcate race and disability so that we can do a better job in analyzing what's before us. And, you know, as Melissa Hickson said, who gets to make the decision whether somebody's quality of life, if they have a disability, that their quality of life is not good? If you noticed, the doctor said, you know, this is the decision of the medical staff and the state. And, you know, have we heard that before? Have we heard that in Tuskegee experiment? Have we heard that when Dr. Sims, who was a doctor who experimented on enslaved women without anesthesia? Have we heard that before? So one of the points of this conversation we're having today, the discussion is, you know, can we look at history and can history inform our advocacy? And can understanding history and ableism inform sort of what remedies or, you know, how we look at cases and how we look at advocacy in our fact investigation in all different areas? And I think the answer is yes. So we're going to go down that journey now. So just for a snapshot, so, you know, back in March, I think this is supposed to be 2020, you know, Black Americans represented 12% of the we represent 12% of the population, but suffered 13.7% of known COVID-19 deaths. So which within less than 1 year, that meant that 1 in every 645 Black Americans were being, you know, were dying from COVID, which is an extraordinarily high number. And if, you know, as you saw in the news, there's this, you know, people were finally talking about, you know, the lack of access to healthcare, environmental racism, you know, because there's more asthma in poor communities. And so all this conversation was happening. And then, you know, research shows that Black, Indigenous, and Latino Americans, when using indirect age adjustment, had COVID death rates at 2.7 times higher than compared to the white population. So, you know, when we think about Michael Hickson, right, and we think about these numbers, we have to think, well, what's going on? It's got to be more complicated than, you know, what we're in terms of looking at it through the lens of disability and race, not just race. And that's the point of this conversation. So I think we have to go back. Like we have to go back to understand, where is sort of this genesis of you don't walk, you don't talk, this is a calculated decision, this is the state, sort of like taking the humanity away from this decision. And again, we can question the medical judgment. Let's just put that aside for a second and think about what are the layers involved in the decision for Michael Hickson, the fact that Black and brown people are dying at such an extraordinarily higher rate than the white population. And we have to go back to 1619, and we have to go back to slavery and anti-Black racism. And so, I'm just going to show a few slides kind of taking you down this very short journey of some highlights during this period that really focused on the racialization of disability and the pathologizing of race. There's a reason that residents in medical schools still believe that Black and brown patients have thicker skin and don't need pain medication. So if you look at this 1787, what are we talking about? 300 plus years ago, this doctor wrote in the Treatise on Tropical Diseases and on Climate of the West Indies. They, meaning Black people, bear surgical operations much better than white people. And what would be the cause of insupportable pain to a white man, a Negro would almost disregard. So we're talking about 300 years of indoctrinating this idea of the Black body as, less than, as not needing the same treatment or the same quality of care as that of the dominant class. And we're looking at, the sale of Negroes, of Black people. And then, our own Thomas Jefferson in 1807 said, I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man on the farm. And this is 1807. So when we think about, healthcare justice, Black women dying at disproportionate rates during childbirth, the high Black infant mortality rate, we have to think about the history and where that's coming from. And so all of this sort of ties into thinking about why did COVID go down the route that it did? Where is the source of all this? And I think talking through this history sort of lets us know, okay, this has been around for a very long time. And thinking about the pathologizing of race, the idea of imputing disability on Blackness is something that's been around for hundreds of years. And here I have a picture of an enslaved person trying to run away. And I pulled a slave petition when I was doing my research because I wanted to kind of better understand this nexus of disability and race. And I found a petition, and this is, 1837. This went before the court and in the district court of the 4th Judicial District, and we're in the state of Louisiana. This person, purchased enslaved people and said, you know what, I don't want them anymore because they have vices and defects. They have epilepsy. They're running away, and we're going to talk about that in a second. Their infirmity is miscarriage or botched childbirth or very poor eyesight. So you have this essence of, what is capitalism? What is productivity? What is the body worth if it can't see, if it can't give birth, if you don't have, if you don't want to have children, if you can't have children, or if we don't want you to have children because you have a disability, right? So the idea of ableism, and I put a brief, we're going to also go into this a little bit later, thinking about ableism, and I want you to carry this through as we continue to talk, ableism as a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. Normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. And we can see that during COVID. And then, just to kind of bring home how over hundreds of years, the indoctrination, the pushing forward, how systems become created is through legitimization of systems, the medical system, the legal system, the political system, which all confirmed, in this desire to push capitalism forward, the idea of the body, the Black body is less than, and the creation of disabilities to attach to the Black body. So here, this is another medical journal by the New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal, which essentially is bringing to the attention of during slavery, the ailments of the Black body, if somebody chooses to want to free themselves from slavery. This Dr. Cartwright labeled a term drapetomania, saying, oh, this person who's trying to be free and trying to escape bondage has a disease of the mind. They have a mental illness. And this is what happens before Negroes run away. They're going to be frightened and panic struck. They're going to be a little sulky. And it's a debasement of the mind. And it's this nervousness, and it is a mental illness called drapetomania. And the way that we're going to fix this is we're going to whip the devil out of them. So it's this imputation of disability on the Black body to control the Black body and to push the idea of productivity, of desirability, excellence forward. And then another disease that was coined by Dr. Cartwright is dystatasia. And this is the idea that Black people are lazy, the sensation of both mind and body. It is another imputed mental illness. So if you think about all this, you're like, why is Professor Chin talking about this in disability rights? Well, think about, do you remember the Contract with America, the idea of welfare reform, the welfare mom, and that narrative, right? Black people are lazy, right? There's an idea that, where did that come from? It has to come from somewhere. So all of the systems that are in place to delegitimize, to marginalize, they start somewhere. So when we look at disability, and we look at race, and we look at the intersections thereof, it's really important to recognize how those systems got so embedded in the roots, of disability, and this is part of it. So, in 1858, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation is approaching. There's some discontent with slavery, but really to keep the Union together, but that's for another day. But, so the idea, oh no, Black folks are going to become free, then there was more sort of pathologizing the Black body for control. And again, this presentation is focusing on anti-Blackness, but this goes toward Indigenous people, other people of color whose bodies are controlled, right? So Native Americans on the reservation, there's the government forced sterilizations to control the body. So this idea of control is not just toward anti-Blackness, right? But so I wanted to also just make that clear. So here, we're fast forwarding in time. Now we're in 1858. Another renowned person in intellect. And remember, to make systems, to move systems forward, there has to be a concerted effort by legitimized systems to push that forward. So here you have the Law of Negro Slavery by somebody named Dr. Cobb, who was also a lawyer and a politician. He might have been a professor also. And the idea was, it is still true that the Negroes are less addicted to crime and are more healthy and long-lived in a state of slavery than of freedom. So this is saying that enslavement, as a result, means that Black folks are less addicted to crime, more healthy and long-lived. Can you see this playing out today? What is this, 1858, can we see what, the same sort of statement, or maybe repackaged a little bit? Can we see it today in the prison industrial complex? Can we see it today in immigration centers? Can we see it today when we're sweeping people with mental illness off the streets and putting them in institutions and hospitals for their care, the sort of paternalistic system? So we have to think about, okay, this is coming from somewhere. And I want to really keep emphasizing that. And so I wanted to put this great sale of slaves to look at the language. So, we're not talking about language today, but language is also part of ableism and the perpetuation of ableism. And we often say those without disabilities, we're able-bodied. And you can see in 1855 the term able-bodied. But what does that term really mean? Able-bodied. That means if you're not able-bodied, you're not normal, you're not productive, desirable, intelligent, excellent, fit, So the idea of it's othering. And so we, even rethinking our language, why do we not just want to say somebody with a disability today? But the language of able-bodied came from somewhere, 1855. 3 men who were bucks, age 20, 26, strong, able-bodied, they will fetch the most money. 1 woman, Sally, 42, great cook, and the list goes on. And then, just moving forward in time, so post slavery, the idea of imputing disability on the Black body, on the body of color for control, the idea that free Black persons post-slavery, mentally inferior, they did not suffer insanity during the first decades of the war, but as they were free, the seeds of disease were sown, is martyred to an heredity. And the term heredity is very important because we're approaching, we're around the time of eugenics, like the early stages of eugenics. So this anti-Blackness going into eugenics, and it sort of blossoms from there, but the roots have already been set. So, as I got into this, I always wondered, the idea of, mental illness and Blackness, disability, COVID, like, why is there this, intertwining of race and disability in history that we're not really talking about in the mainstream? We're not really talking about in our disability classes. So by the mid-19th century, and this is by Jennifer Barkley, and it's a really great article that I encourage you to read because law students have so much extra time, undergrads, The Greatest Degree of Perfection, Disability and the Construction of Race in American Slave Law. And she writes, by the mid-19th century, the perceived links between race and disability in the legal realm were so naturalized that they appeared to have always existed, as though they had been forced through statute and case law. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Case law and statutes didn't perpetuate, I mean, they did, but really it's this indoctrination and support through systems, through the medical system, through social systems, through the political system, through the legal systems. All of it together created this ableist structure, and statutes and case law followed, right? They followed for the most part. So I just want to take a minute. This is a lot to digest. So we certainly can't digest it in this next 25 minutes. But I encourage all of you here to go on TL's website, TL Lewis, and Google 2022 ableism definition, because it changes as the language changes with the times and with what's going on around the world. The definition of ableism, TL, and those who devised this definition recognize that it changed. So ableism is at the center of this discussion, of how can we look at disability rights through a disability justice lens. So I'll just read it and sit with it for a second. So and think about what we talked about with enslavement and the selling of the Black body and the imputation of disability on the Black body. A system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on socially constructed ideas of normalcy, which we've talked about, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted, I'm just looking at the chat, are deeply rooted in eugenics, anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. Eugenics, anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. And you can see all of that if you look back at the history of slavery. This systemic oppression that leaves people and society determining people's value, the value of the Black body mind, and we shouldn't actually separate the body and the mind. So we're going to call it the body mind because they're intricately connected. So determining the value based on, so the systemic oppression that leaves people and society determining people's value based on culture, age, language, appearance, religion, birth, or living place, because living place meaning persons who are in prison, persons who are also in jail, not just their home, but their living place, health, wellness, and or the ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. So there's a lot here. And the whole idea is, this is a system based on, eugenics, the idea of a perfected race, the idea of, if you cannot produce in this way that perpetuates capitalism, then you're just not worthwhile. Let's look at Michael Hickson as an example. Even though, of course, it's always much more complex. Let's look at your age, let's look at the language, your health, your body. Can you reproduce? Can you excel? Can you behave? And in disability law, and we're going to talk about this in the eugenics pipeline, the idea of behaving, what is the repercussions if you don't behave within the ableist construct when we're talking about disability, the idea of behaving. Okay, so I just want to show, I'm a visual learner, so I like to have visuals in my discussion. So I just put this together, and I like this PowerPoint to think about what ableism looks like and what we've all been fed. We've all been given the Kool-Aid, right? So we all have our own internalized ableism. there should be a theme here. So I showed these slides, for one thing, this idea of, exceptionalism. You're here to inspire people with disabilities. You know what? You're also just white. So that's one theme here. And then controlling the body, whose body is worthy, whose body is of value to society, right, during COVID. And today, with medical rationing policies, who gets quality end-of-life treatment, quality of care? And that's still an issue. Even though Omicron is a very different variant, we're in New York City, and the world is vast, and a lot of people need end-of-life care who have COVID, and who's living and who's dying because of that. And the idea of fatism, right, and obesity, and that as ableism, and how that plays in criminal injustice. And the idea of controlling the trans body, controlling trans youth. Where is this coming from? Are you fit? Are you beautiful? Do you conform? And this is ableism. And that's why disability, we can't look at disability through this single issue of just disability when we advocate. It's about all of this. If you're doing LGBTQ rights, right? If you're doing health justice work, it's also about this, always about disability. And this is just too good. I mean, this is ridiculous. This guy got fired. This Ken Turnish guy from, I think, California. We have our old, we have our weak, we have our drains in our resources. The virus is targeting those sectors of our population. But as species, for our nation as a planet, we would strengthen when this is all settled. So this guy posted it, and there's a reason why he's in this position, a political position, and he felt this comfort and this privilege to post this and think it would be okay. And we should also ask ourselves why. And we can look back at these few sides and kind of start putting those pieces together. Because it's easy just to react and say, oh, this guy's such a jerk. He's so, that is ableism. And that ableism plays into this, idea of survival of the fittest, targeting the old, the weak, eugenics. And so I think, when we look at this really complex definition of ableism, I really do hope you look back at and kind of deconstruct it really. And this slide is created by Lydia Brown, who's this incredible disability justice advocate, professor, writer, activist. And, Brown put this wonderful slide together to show that ableism works through all systems: heterosexism, classism, ableism, trans misogyny, transphobia, racism, ageism. It permeates, right? And this is a reason why we have to do sort of a macro look at our work to see how ableism is infused in what we're doing, in the advocacy that we're doing, or in the practice we're doing, or in the conversations we're having. So how does this relate to the ADA? So, there's no question. So the idea was, the ADA has done its 30-year celebration in 2020. Yes. And there's no doubt that there have been tremendous advances since 1990's passage of the ADA. We have community integration, access to reasonable accommodations in significant areas of life for disabled folks, transportation, employment, education, healthcare, access to auxiliary aids and services, and the list goes on. And the idea of the ADA and, sort of deconstructing the ADA is something I spent a lot of time with until I wrote this article is, it centers on independence, community integration, get out there, you can work, you can be a part, you can be with non-disabled people and integrate. That's the whole language. Disabled people should not be segregated, isolated. You should integrate with non-disabled people. Let's make that happen. Okay, that sounds good. So the focus was on independence, autonomy, self-sufficiency, and advancing disability equality, really through litigation and civil rights-based strategies. And so, I was looking at the ADA, because I generally just look at the provisions that will help our client, with reasonable accommodations or being more integrated in the community. And then I found this provision. And this is in the findings and purpose. I thought this was fascinating. And, I've been doing disability for several years, and I never looked at this provision because it never came up. So this is in the findings and purpose of the ADA. So they're all chatting about the ADA, right? And let's draft this bill. And this really was a bill to get people with disabilities, into employment it really was sort of a welfare reform bill. And you have to remember, this is the 90s, the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. So this says the continuing existence of unfair and unnecessary discrimination and prejudice denies people with disabilities the opportunity to compete, the opportunity to compete on an equal basis, equality, equal basis, and to pursue those opportunities for which our free society is justifiably famous and costs the United States billions of dollars in unnecessary expenses, resulting in dependency and non-productivity. Well, this is like, if there's a word bubble around people at the table who are drafting the ADA, this is what it would say. We can't have dependency or non-productivity. We are the United States. This is costing us billions of dollars. And we are a free society with all these opportunities. But then we got to think, wait a second, it's 1990. Who are they talking about? What unjustifiably famous, country, what free society, what opportunities? In the 1990s, Black people were, the poverty rate was significantly less than those who were not white. People of color were dying at disproportionate rates. The unemployment rate was high. So this was not talking to people of color. It was talking to a specific segment of the disabled population, right? That could, one, dependence, non-productivity, less focus on capitalism. And ADA is a capitalist structured bill. And I think it's fine. That's the construct we're working in, and it's something we should be very aware of. And the idea of this class status concept I want to talk about. So, Arlene Meyerson, who's this great professor, wrote an article back in 1992, and she talked about this class status concept as to, the idea of how, Section 504 of the ADA, which if you haven't seen Crip Camp, I strongly suggest you do. It's really wonderful. It talks about the Section 504 sit-ins, which was this really wonderful 25-day sit-in by disabled people that brought together a cross section of the disability community, blind people, Black people, brown people, queer people, and the list goes on, and non-disabled people, the Black Panther Party, Glide Memorial Church, they were all a part of this movement to help pass the regulations of Section 504, right? And that was the first disability statute that prohibited prohibited discrimination based on disability for entities that receive federal funding. And then Arlene Meyerson said that there was a class status concept that allowed this to happen. The idea that as a class, people with disabilities are a group that face similar discrimination in employment, education, and access to society. So that class concept, she says, really pushed, Section 504, the advocacy, and pushed the ADA forward, right? And I think perhaps at that time that is true, but the class status concept, which I think the idea that we are one as disabled persons, we are one as Black people, we are one as LGBT people, we know that it's exclusionary. We know that it's exclusionary, right? So when we're talking about this class concept of a group of people with disabilities facing similar discrimination, what does that even mean? What is similar discrimination? And that's looking at this language of the ADA, that's what it's looking at, similar discrimination. But what about people of color with disabilities? What about that added discrimination, that compounded, that reconfigured discrimination? And the class concept, another way to look at it is in the gay rights movement, trans people were excluded, right? There's an idea when the Employment Non-Discrimination Act was going to go into the floor, I forget when, I was with Lambda, I think, or I was in law school, that, the Human Rights Campaign wanted to say, let's not include trans folks because it's going to hurt our chances of passing this Employment Non-Discrimination Act. And that was the first big schism in the gay rights, agenda. And then let's not even talk about marriage equality and who is this benefiting. So all of these movements, it's not just disability, like it's very single issue in terms of this class status concept also, not just with the issue itself, disabilities more particular, but this class status, because it's exclusionary. And we have to think about that. And that does not discredit the advances of the ADA, but we have to remember that we're working within a statute that isn't, really constructed to think systemically. Just like, civil rights litigation or, the civil rights model isn't intended to think systemically. It's really to think about individual rights. So what do we want to do? Well, the idea here is just, can we reimagine the ADA? Can we reimagine an ADA that's going to go beyond, the single issue of disability and whiteness? And so the idea of this article and my hope, as this is all also very new to me. I've been running clinics. I started the disability clinic at Brooklyn Law School for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And my framing of disability rights didn't center disability justice at that time. So I'm also on this journey of figuring out how I can be better. So reimagining a disability rights future that really incorporates this ableism and racism consciousness we just talked about. Can we recenter the strategy of individualism, right, of autonomy? Can we, reimagine this to bridge this disconnect that really has developed over time, right, for the promises of the ADA as they relate to people who are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color? Can we do that? I think the answer is yes, but I think it takes work. This recalibration, I argue, it really requires a shift, like an informed consciousness, that we confront the role of racism, our own history, our own internalized ableism, and its intersections with this disabled Black and multiple marginalized disabled communities. And so that's the idea. And, disability justice, I believe, really can help guide us. Disability justice is not, a movement. It's a framework, it's a theory. And it's very independent, kind of like the Black Lives Matters movement, right? It's decentralized. So that's really important. So talking about disability justice as, how can disability justice sort of guide us in reimagining? It's not a co-option of disability justice. It's using the principles within it. So what is disability justice? So in 2005, the concept and idea of disability justice grew, and it was created and led by disabled people of color and queer gender nonconforming people of color. And it was a response to, how the disability rights movement really prioritized a single issue civil rights framework, and at the expense of the lived experience of disabled people who really lived, quote unquote, from this is not my language, but the disability justice language, who lived at the intersecting junctures of oppression. So when we think about class status, right, that we just talked about, that Arlene Marson wrote, this is kind of like, well, let's flip that. What class status? It was exclusionary, right? It left out at the lived experiences of disabled people who live at intersecting junctures of oppression. So the disability justice said, but we have to rethink this, right? So we have to recenter the experiences of disabled people of color, immigrants with disabilities, queers with disabilities, trans and gender nonconforming people with disabilities who are houseless, who are incarcerated, whose ancestral lands were stolen, amongst others. So it's centering the disabled voices of all of these different, multiply marginalized communities whose voices were really just, not brought to the forefront in the ADA struggle. And so the idea is pushing against capitalist notions, pushing against the idea of productivity, right? That pushing against, there's this one normalcy of body and mind. And so, you hear these ideas of disability justice, you're like, wow, that's awesome. All bodies are unique and essential. Nobody's gonna argue with that. Our bodies have value, they're complex. We have to move with a universal collective access. This is disability justice, but there are 10 very specific principles of disability justice. I won't read all of them. So there are 10 principles of disability justice that I think can help us as disability rights advocates, as advocates in our own lives, not even if disability law advocates. And this spills over. So if you're on this call and you're not practicing disability rights, it doesn't matter. This spills over into all practices. And the 3 principles I think can really resonate in recentering disability rights framework is intersectionality, leadership of the most impacted, so 1 and 2, and also number 4, a commitment to cross-movement organizing. Now, these ideas aren't new. Critical race theorists have been talking about this stuff forever. What's new, I think, with this is centering ableism in this practice, right? And centering ableism in this practice, centering the ideas of anti-Blackness, of anti-capitalism, and all those structures in the intersectionality focus, leadership of the most impacted, and also cross-movement organizing. So, getting up to speed and really learning about disability rights and disability justice, I'm like, let me do a snap. So when I was writing this, I thought, let me do a snapshot. What's going on in the Black disabled community that is 2020, Black folks and people of color are dying of COVID it was just it was a bad year. It was just, everything was bad in 2020, 2021. So I went to look and I pulled out 4 or 5 narratives of Black disability issues that I just wanted to highlight and, figure out, this is where the ADA is falling short. So I pulled one, and I call this the eugenics pipeline. So the idea of sort of revolving inequities of the eugenics pipeline, where the ADA is just falling short because we're filing these lawsuits, and let's just go on. We're filing these lawsuits, but the same things keep happening. Black and brown people keep dying at the hands of police, or being murdered at the hands of police. They're being segregated in schools. Why is this still happening? And I call this eugenics pipeline, and my definition of that is really the process by which systems of state and societal control use specific categorizations of disability to legitimize incarceration, the segregation, the discarding, and the confiscation of the racialized disabled body line. To say that again, so the eugenics pipeline is a system of state and societal control that uses specific categorizations of disability to legitimize incarceration, segregation, discarding, and confiscation of the racialized disabled body mind. And so I thought about the eugenics pipeline, and I just pulled 4, issues that were happening and that have been happening that impact Black and brown disabled folks, and nothing haven't been resolved. So here is the Judge Rottenberg Center. And for those who don't know, this is in Massachusetts, and it was created in 1971. It's a self-proclaimed day and residential school that enrolls students from ages 5 to adults labeled as emotionally disturbed. And let's go back. So labeled as emotionally disturbed, I put that in quotes, because what does that really mean? And so we go back to our ableism definition and the idea of behaving, right, and conformity and ableist structures. And so this residential school, it houses these young people who are emotionally disturbed, intellectually disabled, on the autism spectrum, and exhibit, quote, on their website, behavioral, emotional, and or psychiatric problems. So in March 2020, so this is the only school in the country, or I'm gonna say school, but it's the only, let's call it institution for what it is. This is the only institution in the whole country that uses electronic shock to routinely discipline students. So in March 2020, after decades and decades of advocates, everybody fighting, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, said, okay, we're gonna ban this practice. The UN had already written a report about it, how this is torture. After all of this, finally the FDA is like, okay, March 2020, let's ban the use of electronic shock treatment, or quote unquote treatment, the use of this discipline, because for X, Y, and Z reasons, it's really horrible. It is a form of torture. And I thought, so this seems like a positive thing. Why did it take so long? What's going on at JRC? So I went back to look and see what is the makeup of JRC? Who goes there? Who are the students enrolled there? And looking back at the student enrollment, Black students enrollment went from 40% in 2002 to 53% in 2018. And this is the latest statistics available. And in 2018, this institution, 73% are students of color, Black and brown. So in this middle slide here, or this middle photo, so in 2012, I think, a recording was exposed that occurred in 2002 showing Andre McCollins being given shock, being shocked 31 times at Judge Rottenberg Center for their behavior. And his body was writhing, he was screaming in pain. He said, stop, please stop. And he was being punished for misbehaving. And this happened in 2002. The video surfaced in 2012. 2020, the FDA is saying, okay, you know what? Let's get rid of this. So we have to think, why did this take so long? Who's this impacting? Whose bodies are we discarding or discrediting? And this is Andre McCollins. And so as this article was in publication, it just so happened that the court heard this FDA, so the school, of course, appealed this FDA ruling. I teach admin, so it's kind of cool. They asked for judicial review, and they reviewed the FDA ruling and said, you know what, no, FDA can't do this. They don't lack the statutory authority to ban a medical device for particular use. So actually, this electronic electric shock device is still being used on Black and brown kids. So I looked at that. I also looked at something called the Georgia Net for Education Therapeutic Support. And this is a support of schools all across the state of Georgia. All right, and there's a lawsuits right now. So these schools, very similar to Judge Rottenberg Center, houses emotionally disturbed kids, sends them to schools only with themselves. These kids are put in dog leashes if they misbehave. They are segregated in buildings that were once occupied by the Jim Crow era. They were physically restrained nearly 10,000 times just in the year 2016. What's the demographic of this school? 51% of GNET students are comprised of Black folks, compared to 37% who are actually Black people in the zone school. So primarily Black and brown students. And so this school doesn't provide education. It engages in different forms of torture and discipline. It houses students and segregated. There's no true education. Students don't graduate, and it's mainly Black and brown students. And one reason I focused on these two is the idea of community integration in the ADA is putting students into the community. So the idea of these two is, okay, we're still going to educate our students in the community, right? So this is, was this a part of the ADA plan? So GNETs in 2010, the Department of Justice did an extensive investigation and found that Georgia violated the ADA on multiple fronts for community integration and other things. And that was 2010. In 2020, so nothing happened. And then 2 lawsuits were filed. The DOJ filed their lawsuit, a private organization filed their lawsuit. They passed summary judgment. They're going to merge the 2 lawsuits, and this is now a pending case. But we're talking about, the government already investigated, found a DOJ violation. Why through our disability advocacy have we not resolved or moved past these issues? What are the intersections we're missing? Access to education, poverty rights, right? Access to housing. What are the issues infused here that are making this disability framework not work, right? This disability rights framework isn't working because this stuff is happening. And I know I've been talking for quite a long time, so I'm going to wrap up in a minute. A couple other things. So in 2020, there was another lawsuit. So very similar, let's just get people with disabilities, put them in institutions. We'll file these lawsuits, maybe we'll get them out, but this just keeps happening. This eugenics pipeline keeps happening. So in Alameda County, it was a great idea that they would just swoop up people with mental health disabilities, mainly Black and brown folks, and just put them in psychiatric hospitals, sometimes for years. And they were doing this, and the DOJ came in and said, you know what, you can't do this, in a 45-page report. But if we go back, right, to the Georgia schools, that report was written in 2010, and that stuff was still happening. This report was just written last year. So perhaps there's a different way that this is going to resolve itself. And then, of course, police killing Black people. So we have Charlene Lies, and the idea is, she was, this pregnant woman, had children. She had mental health diagnoses and had, for years, the police were aware of it. She called 911 to report a burglary. Police showed up at her home, and she was shot 7 times. And in 2020, there was a vigil. So that's how Charlene Lies, was killed in 2017, but, she had a mental health illness. Police came in and shot her to death. And these things keep happening. It's the ADA does not apply, and there's a Supreme Court case that passed on the issue, and it hasn't been resolved yet. And if the ADA did apply, how can we make it better so that this doesn't happen again? And I also, just an update on the LALSA case, just last year, it was settled in Seattle for $3.5 million for her family. So, things to think about. And then again, incarcerated deaf people in prison. In 2020, after decades and decades of advocates saying people in prison don't have access to auxiliary aids or support services, they cannot talk to their attorneys, they can't talk to their loved ones. The FCC issues proposed regs saying, hey, what should we do about the telecommunication devices in prisons? And this was a notice they issued in 2020, but this has been going on forever. And then you had to go hunt in this 94-page proposed rule in paragraph 136 to find this provision that dealt with this issue, right? And so, the idea is this, that Black people with disabilities, deaf people, Black people being killed by police, Black and brown people being swooped up, put in hospitals indefinitely, young people with behavioral problems being segregated in these institutions called schools. You know, where is the ADA and where is it falling short? There aren't any answers here, but there's hope and there's creativity and there's ideas for doing better, as I said earlier. So that what my proposal is, you know, there's a consequence to not confronting disability through this intersectional lens of ableism and racism, centered in the idea of intersectionality, centering the voices of those most impacted in cross-movement lawyering, right? To really confront the structural inequalities. You know, so when we engage in implementing our remedial approaches as we advocate, you know, these conditions fester, you know, sort of perpetuating injustices if we don't think about this. So if we think about, for example, you know, the idea of sweeping people up on the streets who have mental health conditions that don't have access to care, it's a health justice issue. It's a disability rights issue. It's a health justice issue, right? It's a poverty law issue. Those are the cross movement buildings that we need, right? To not just advocate for, you know, community integration to get people out of institutions, but to get access to, you know, mental health treatment. So disability rights, we can't do it alone. And we have to center the voices of those people who are being picked up on the streets, right? And we have to center those voices and create those narratives, because that makes for stronger advances for justice. So where do we go from here? This is where I'm gonna end, hopefully on sort of a roadmap. You know, how can we approach our advocacy, or, you know, in any area of law that you're practicing, or any area that you're advocating, and even if you're not, you know, in law school yet, because I think there's undergrads here, you know, what can we do? We'll confront internalized ableism. Let's think about the language you use. Let's think about, you know, why decisions are made, and really get a firmer grasp on that, so that we look and don't miss things when we're advocating, so we ask the right questions. Also, so that we can be more open and engaging to communities that perhaps felt that, you know, our doors were closed, right? To, you know, reopen that line of communication, because there is, you know, between the Black community and disabled community, other communities, there is, you know, history there that has to be met. Know the history. And I do this in all my, like in my my administrative law class, I bring in history. You know, I bring in the fact that executive action was the Emancipation Proclamation. We don't think about the fact that even in slavery, we're using executive orders to impact the lives of millions of people. So we have to know our history, because it helps us better understand systems of oppression that you're advocating against that impact your client. And it will also help you better, you know, understand your client or those that you're advocating for. An intersectional approach in a more nuanced way, as Professor Sammy Schalk has expressed, you know, this intersectional approach that acknowledges the role of identity, experience, social systems of privilege and oppression of social constructions, and, you know, centering and amplifying marginalized voices and building cross-movement solidarity. This is all sort of this mixed pot of things, you know, that we need to add into our repertoire of the disability rights framework that really just focuses on litigation and policy advocacy. Because clearly, looking at this eugenics pipeline, that alone is not going to, you know, address these really deeply rooted systemic issues. So, you know, approaching our advocacy and our work through this, you know, more complex and more multifaceted lens can hopefully lead us in you know, in a direction where we can center principles of disability justice as we practice our advocacy, whether that advocacy is disability rights. So thank you for listening, and I know that was quite long, and I hope that and that was helpful.
Sadly, lots to say. So yeah, we could talk about this for ages. So thank you, Professor Chin. I really, I just want to make a few comments, and then I do want to open it up for questions, but I have a couple myself. So one, I want to really appreciate your acknowledgement that this is a journey, and we have to be willing to grow and change our thinking as advocates and as educators. I think that's a really important point that you made. And I think about when I first started a disability clinic in the early 2000s, and I remember surveying legal services lawyers. I was doing this in Boston, and I remember surveying legal services lawyers about the work that I wanted to do. And I was really trying to gauge where were the gaps and where could my clinic really fill some of those gaps. And they talked about the importance of focusing on increasing access to monetary benefits. That was the focus. And so much of that comes from a kind of classic poverty law model, rather than benefits as an entry point for access to treatment, right? Which I think is really a critical distinction. I also really liked your inclusion of the Judge Rotenberg Center as one of your ripped from the headlines examples in the your year in the review section of your paper, because I am well aware, having lived there, and done work there in this realm, that those issues have been raised for years, as you indicated, about the individuals who are institutionalized there. And despite support by some of the parents of the kids who are there, in fact, many of the parents. So there was a real divide among even the parents between advocating for the continued use of these devices versus those who were really raising legitimate concerns about the treatment of their kids there. So my first question to you, and then I'll see if others have some, is, you and others appropriately critique the legislative strategy around the ADA, as well as the statutory language itself, because of its focus on single issue advocacy and the overemphasis on goals of self-reliance and independence. And I think you're spot on that was catering to conservatives and to George Bush, who ultimately signed it into law in order to help it pass. And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts about lessons learned in connection with future civil rights legislation, and what legislative achievements should be at the forefront of disability justice.
Right. I think the biggest lesson learned is who's at the table. Nothing, for us without us. And, in terms of pushing legislation forward, the voices of those impacted have to be at the table. Those with intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, those who have been, suffered through Judge Rotenberg Center or the GNETS program. When we're thinking about our strategies, even before legislation, we have to understand hear from the voices of those who were impacted, so that we can frame, our legislative strategies in that way. I think there's a lot of different things that can be priorities in the disability community, and there are conversations all over. I'm really passionate and involved in the sexual rights and access to sexuality supports and services for young people and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I know that in New York State in particular, that legislation has been really slow, and there's been pushback for years. And disabled folks have brought that to the table, or have tried and have just been pushed away. And I think that's one area. There's a lot of work around parents with intellectual disabilities. Still to this day, New York has really bad law. And a lot of states have bad law that if you have an intellectual disability, by default, you can have your kid taken away. So, these fundamental civil rights of privacy, bodily autonomy, the right to parent, guardianship is truly problematic. The ability to, what's taken away with guardianship, technically your right to vote, your right to make. So, I think the one thing I would say is lesson learned is to bring people at the table in those legislative planning stages in a way that we perhaps haven't done, because the world has changed since 1990, and we're not living in the same ADA world in 1990 that we're living in now.
So I want to ask one more question too. So going back to your point about how you're on a journey as well, I'm curious, from one educator and one advocate to another, how does the disability justice framework change how you teach disability law, or how you run your clinic?
So in a million ways. So I really, so let's start with my disability class. So I'm really infusing so much history into my disability class that I think my students are like, how is this going to help me? And so I'm trying to, and I'm doing that also in my admin. I'm doing that in my classes because I think we have to have this racism, ableism consciousness to be stronger advocates. And so that's one. And in terms of, I think for my clinic, I was on parental leave last semester, and then last year, and then the year before that, the clinic was online. And then, so I haven't, it's still very new, and ideas I have are really focused on cross movement building. So I think one of my strategies is going to be, and I think it just takes, and I think this is great for students, is, reaching out and saying, I run this disability clinic. You focus on racial justice. Disability is a racial justice issue. Let's figure out how we can get, and that's going to be my new. I did this with guardianship already, and so I think like identifying different areas that we want the clinic to focus on, and then building that trust with other organizations to build that cross-movement strategy. That's one thing. And also what I'm doing more in our complaints, in our advocacy, is centering the voices of our clients even more, meaning not just their story, but their identities, right? There's a default whiteness in law. Like when you read it's just default white. Go back to the Buck v. Bell case, however, they say that she's white, and that's for another time. But this default whiteness, it shouldn't be there anymore. And does it harm your complaint when you say this is a Black, person, I think it's really important strategically to think about those things also. Bringing in the identity, educating the court is another way that I think is really important. I think we've been doing it always, but doing it in a more purposeful way to bring in these principles of disability justice and particularly intersectionality.
I really love that last point that you made, because I run a program for self-represented litigants in the federal courthouse, and we do a lot of civil rights and employment discrimination cases. And one of the things that I've been thinking about writing about is it's such a different presentation of the case when the client is building their own narrative, literally, as the self-represented litigant. And the way that we draft motions, the way that we draft complaints is so different. And I think very eye-opening in how to infuse more of that narrative and the client's identity into the storytelling, even when you are actually serving as a lawyer for somebody. I want to open it up to see if there are questions from anybody. Yes, Professor Niles.
I'm trying. Oh, you unmuted me. You should have that power always to be able to mute me. That would make a world a better place.
God, that would really.
Professor Chen, that was a fantastic presentation. I really appreciate it. The power of that video that you showed, or the sort of recording, just reminded me how much of what we've seen in terms of sort of change or activism around change has resulted from the technology of cell phones and the ability to record lots of things, including interactions between police and people of color, particularly Black people, but people of color, and interactions of police with people with disabilities, or the range of those different issues. But the nature of healthcare and healthcare decisions, like the decision involved in that video, are appropriately but significantly private. Can you think of a way to focus the kind of attention that would have that kind of societal sort of impact and would create that kind of societal focus in an area which, by definition, doctors making determinations, other things that happen that are much more outside of the sort of the public view than the very public interaction between police and the people that police interact with?
So can you just rephrase your sort of question more specifically?
Yeah, so how do you get at it?
I want to make sure.
One of the ways in which there's been activism around police reform is people saw videos of George Floyd getting killed. We don't have videos of those sort of things around this issue. So is there a way can you think of a way, and maybe there isn't, to get that kind of public attention without that opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're talking about it in terms of getting the people who are impacted, their voices forward, right? I think photographs and interviews and discussions are just as impactful, but I think those discussions are happening by the lawyers or the advocates. They're driving the dialogue and they're driving the narrative. So I don't think per se, having a video or audio is necessarily something that, will impact the case, and it can't have the same impact. But I do think putting the voices forward, the faces forward, is critical in the work that we're doing, critical. And I think it can come alive on paper. Like, right, I tell my students, you need to show me what you're writing. I want to see what this person is experiencing. So you can do that, right, as an advocate, even on paper. And it's just about reshifting the narrative, and whether it's through voice, through written voice, through a photograph, whatever the case, even the name of the person, really basic things that will push that narrative forward, you know. And I think maybe the drama might not be there, but it's about the impact, like the sustained impact of what you're presenting, not the immediate impact.
So Mark Rosen, I think you were next. I also want to give you a shout out because I haven't yet had a chance to tell you congratulations about your appointment to the New York State Developmental Disabilities Planning Council. Bravo.
Congrats.
Thank you. Actually, I was going to speak up more to an element that you didn't perhaps address in your paper. And it's the fact that the intersection of ableism and just about any other form of discrimination has an added layer to it, which is that in most cases, we disabled people have the most to fear from our immediate families. One of our most common causes of death is filicide. And especially in the case of developmentally disabled people. And I wonder how your practice is informed given that issue.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, for that comment. No, I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, as I said, looking back at my paper, there are definitely things I would tweak and improve and expand upon. And I think what you're saying is, you know, of course, and I think it goes back to ableism, the idea that, you know, you have a child who isn't in your mind in the confines of producing fitness, attraction, all of these things. And therefore, fanticide has been, and the way it's treated in the media is very problematic because it really sympathizes with the parent as if, you know, they had no choice, you know, I had to do this and their child had be. So I absolutely, and I think that definitely is an important component that I could be more mindful of in terms of my discussions.
Sarah Murphy, our other great student who has been involved in starting our new disability rights group. You're next.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you so much for all your information, and the presentation was amazing. I'm sure like other people are just like really stuck on the whole, I think Judge Rothberg Center. I don't remember the exact name. Like I can't get that image out of my head. Yes, thank you. Is there any update on like the litigation and what people are trying to do to take away their right to keep providing shock therapy?
So the last I heard was, I think a law firm is taking up the cause and has asked for narratives and is trying to collect narratives. I don't know, I think it's a litigation strategy is my guess. And that was recently, so around 6 or so months ago, I received an email. And so I think, I don't know all the details, and I'm sure, but the idea is to gather the narratives and then build, I think probably a case on that.
Thank you. I'm just like, I can't wrap my head around how that's still able to be happening, but thank you for bringing that up.
Susan Ryan, you're next.
I think you're
sorry. Professor Chin, thank you so much. You know, I've had a disability my whole life. I had got polio at 18 months of age. So my whole career on and off I've had jobs outside of the disability community in my, you know, lifetime, and also within the disability community. And I think what you said about, you know, having coalitions is so important. And traditionally, what I've always seen is that having a disability, you're really kind of in your own category. So I have a physical disability. It doesn't mean that I would be interacting so much with parents of autistic children. But if we could figure out some way in the United States to really pull that together, because that's where the strength is. I mean, it's got to do with voting rights. You know, if places aren't accessible, it's got to do with everything. And I just think that point of you know, what we all need to do is really pull together coalitions so we don't lose these rights. Because I think we're living in a time right now where people are concerned about rights being taken care of, and the disabled traditionally, you know, only came to the table 30 years ago with the ADA, where all the other groups already, you know, codified their human rights. I just think that, what you're saying and what you're doing is so important. It really is. And I just think for any of the future lawyers on and anybody that's an advocate for people with disabilities, I just want to thank you and thank Hofstra.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I have one more question. You talked in your paper about a little bit of a critique about CRT, about critical race theory, and its tendency to medicalize disability as an immutable biological category. And since you didn't talk about that today at all, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to maybe say a few words about that for those who haven't had a chance to read your paper.
Yeah, so I think one of the, and it's not just, and I can't take ownership of that critique completely, I think, with critical race theory, that, disability isn't like infused in that. And the idea of disability as, this medicalized, model is really sort of pushed forward, as opposed to the idea that society has to adjust and society has to, the social construction of disability. And I think, it was a critique because, critical race theory is what everybody's talking about right now, but it's not the be all and end all. And we have to critique critical race theory, right? To make it, adapt to the world. Because remember, critical race theory really got its start, the 70s, and beyond. So again, this is a changing world. So critiquing the idea that, disability is medicalized, and that sort of stops the conversation, right? And there are times when it's important to have, this medicalized idea of disability. Is it possible that that's okay sometimes? And I think these are conversations that have to happen, but they're more complex, and we have to infuse them into our critical race theory and not have them so bifurcated. And that's really more what I was saying. That's a great, thanks. I haven't thought about that because I haven't reread it in a while.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it jumped out at me as well. All right, well, if there are no more questions, I again, thank you so much for a really wonderful presentation and for having the inclination to write this article in the midst of the pandemic. So I suppose there are some good things that have come out of the last 2 years. And I appreciate you joining us today. And I know I speak on behalf of everybody who was here, how grateful we are for you sharing with us about your paper, and hopefully it has sparked people's interest in reading it as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you all for attending.
Yeah, it's nice to see you all. Thank you. Take care.
And Natalie, I was laughing because my students were probably nodding their heads and or rolling their eyes when you were talking about the importance of history, because I start off the semester with them reading excerpts from No Pity, and we talk a lot about the kind of the progression of the different phases of disability advocacy and the history around how individuals with disabilities have been treated through, a century or more in our country. And then we also compare and contrast with other countries. So I love that you included that reference.
Yeah, awesome. I'd love to see your syllabus.
I know, I was thinking it would be kind of fun to share ideas.
Yeah, I keep changing, so yeah, I would like that too. And about your idea with the clinic, I feel I just got to CUNY in 2019, is that right? And then COVID hit in 2020. And so, BLS for those 5 years, I didn't have this consciousness. This is a very new consciousness for me. So,
same.
And the CUNY clinic is only one semester, which is pretty challenging.
Ooh, that's rough.
I'm recalibrating myself personally as to how to make, sort of this continuity of disability advocacy here at CUNY.